Nissan advised that the brake fluid be changed every 2 years. The reason for this is DOT3 and DOT4 brake fluid is hygroscopic. So what does hygroscopic mean? Basically, brake fluid absorbs moisture from the air. The danger is that any moisture in the fluid could vaporise under heavy braking conditions, and this can lead to possible braking failure just when you need it most, as a vapour can be compressed, thus not transmitting the effort from the brake pedal to the brakes themselves. Also, the moisture can increase the corrosion within the braking components, like the pistons, etc. Other than a trolley jack, you'll need the following to flush the brake fluid through: 21mm socket to remove the road wheels, 7mm socket or spanner for the nipples, 1 maybe 2 litres of DOT4 brake fluid, some silicone grease, possibly some new bleed nipples, a torque wrench able to do 8 Nm and 100 Nm, and possibly some dedicated brake fluid tooling. So I would have liked to have used this, which was the Sealey VSO212, and that's a pressure bleeder. That's what I normally try and use, and it actually does have a universal adapter, but on the brake fluid reservoir of the Nissan, it looked a little bit too fragile to start trying to clamp things onto it. So unfortunately, that has to go to one side. So onto what we will be using, which is 2 litres of DOT4 brake fluid. I think you can use DOT3 as well. And I'm going to be using one of these, which is a top-up bottle. This one's from Sykes Pickervant, and that should keep the reservoir constantly topped up while I'm pumping the brakes. There's a little on valve there, and you can adjust the height of this depending on your reservoir. And then at the caliper end, I'll be using one of these catch containers. This is the Sealey VSO212. And inside this is like a one-way valve. So as you push the fluid down, it's going to go through this black rubber valve, and that should stop air coming back into the system, which is the last thing we want. So anyway, on to the rest of the tooling. We will need a pair of hose clamps like these. These are designed so they don't actually pinch the hose too much, but just enough to actually close it. And I'll be using a 7mm socket for the bleed nipples, and also a 7mm spanner. Now you should torque the bleed nipples up to the correct torque, so I will be using a miniature torque wrench. And I'm probably going to change these old bleed nipples because they're terrible, and they're only about £5 for a set. And it comes with a bit of silicone grease. And then once we put the wheel back on, we'll need a 21mm socket and of course a torque wrench to ensure that we actually put our road wheels back on correctly. Now, if you find the bleed nipples to be in the same condition that mine were, you may find these extra items come in rather handy. Plenty of plus gas or WD-40, a very fine point blowtorch with a heat resistant mat, a small hammer for gentle tapping, some form of locking wrench, and some replacement bleed nipples. So I found these extra tools worked pretty well. Plenty of plus gas, a nice map gas which goes up to 1850 degrees centigrade, along with a mat to protect the hoses, a small hammer just to tap away gently on the bleed nipple, a toothed locking jaw that would actually get those old nipples out, and you may well need some new nipples afterwards, such as these, and they're about £5 a set. Also a little bit of silicone grease. Here are a couple of overview photographs of the key items under the bonnet that we will encounter. Here you can see the brake fluid bottle, the power steering fluid and the screen wash. And also note the internal filter inside the reservoir. First wheel. The first wheel in the correct sequence is the rear right, so we must start here. Here is an overview photograph to show all the key items we will come across. So here you can see the brake caliper, the bleed nipple, the brake disc, the brake line and hose, and the handbrake cable. So the first job is to use a 21mm socket and to break the 5 wheel nuts loose, with the car on the ground that is. And then we can jack the car up and then simply remove those 5 nuts. And when I actually do remove the wheel, I'm somewhat shocked by the fact the brake bleed nipple is almost non-existent, which is not good news. So this is the scary sight before my eyes. Basically the bleed nipple doesn't exist. It's rusted to pieces. So let's try a bit of plus gas. I'm probably being a bit optimistic, just spraying the rusty metal, so I thought let's clean up the metal with a wire brush first. That way when I do spray the plus gas on, it might actually stand a chance of getting to the threads of the bleed nipple. And it's so thin there, any twisting effect is going to shear that off. So I really need to make sure this is loose. So I thought, gentle shocking. Not too much, just enough to hopefully start shaking things up. So gentle and plenty of time and perseverance, I'm hoping will be the key to this. I'll give it a bit of map gas now. Not too much, I don't want to overheat it really, I just want to try and get those threads on the bleed nipple moving slightly inside the caliper, so that when I do exert a twisting effect to it, it actually will hopefully come undone and not just shear off. Because obviously if it shears off or comes undone slightly and then shears off, that's the vehicle out of operation, because I'll have no rear brake. So it is pretty important that I actually remove this bleed nipple in one piece. And to drill out a bleed nipple as well and then clean the threads, it just doesn't really bear thinking about, especially if the other 3 are like this. So the key to this is really patience and plenty of it. So now I'm actually feel like I'm ready to actually exert some turning force onto this bleed nipple. And there's a very slight bit of movement. Now if I carry on, it was very likely to still shear off. So I've got to be very careful here, still feel for it. So we're starting to get brake fluid oozing out, which is a good sign. So I'm just going to keep moving this nipple backwards and forwards. A spanner's no good. What I am going to do now to minimise the brake fluid loss onto the floor is put some clamps on there while I take this backwards and forwards. So I'm having to use like these, seem to be the only tool I can actually use on this, because they are sort of wedging the nipple and actually getting a good grip on it. I mean, you could try mole grips, but I don't know. These seem to be just the ticket at the moment. So while it's working, I'll keep with it. It obviously does create a little bit of damage on there, but I don't think that's really of any importance at this point. And once this job's done, I'm more than likely to replace all 4 of these bleed nipples with some new ones. So we eventually got it free in the end, which was brilliant news. So almost a little miracle in itself. I did not think I would actually pull that off. So I'm just going to put a little bit of copper ease or copper grease on there. May not technically be the right thing to do on a brake component, but for the moment that would do. It means I have got a working bleed nipple and I can now carry on with the job in hand, which is hopefully to actually bleed all the brakes. With the bleed nipple number 1 finally free, we can get back to the task of flushing clean brake fluid through the pipes. So I'm going to use an automatic Reservoir top-up bottle. So as the fluid goes down, it will automatically fill it up, keeping it topped up. Now you must bear in mind that you must always use fresh brake fluid, being that it's hygroscopic. You don't want old stuff that's been sat on the shelf collecting water inside. So it's worth putting a cloth underneath the reservoir, as brake fluid can damage paintwork. Now we just need to remove this little filter here, pop that to one side so that the bottle can then sit inside the reservoir. So the theory is, as the fluid goes down, this bottle will allow the same amount of fluid back out, always keeping it at the maximum level. So it just clips on at the back, and then we just got to turn it on, little tap there, and then that should take the reservoir start filling up, which it is. So back at the bleed nipple now, I'm just going to put a bit of grease on here in the, I don't know, some sort of hope that it will stop air going back in, because that nipple is in such a poor state. So anyway, time to start the actual bleeding process on the first wheel. So let's start by getting into the car and pushing the brake pedal down. I normally press it about halfway. I don't want to push it all the way to the floor, because it will push the piston in the master cylinder further than normal, and sometimes if the master cylinder wears, then the rubber could get stuck. That's just my precaution. So anyway, so there we are. The reservoir is topping up as I'm pumping the brake pedal, and the bottle connected to the bleed nipple is also filling up by the same amount. No surprise there. So I've put in a whole bottle, which is at least half a litre, I think. So give it a good flush. So the brake fluid looks nice and clean in that tube that we just saw. And the reservoir is still filling up there. As you can see, it's now at the maximum point, which is good news. So I'm just going to close the bleed nipple with a pair of pliers. I think I will be changing these bleed nipples because that's not really suitable. Again, I'm going to pop a bit of grease on there just to aid in the removal of that nipple when I change those to new ones. So the old brake fluid we must not discard down the drain. It is poisonous, so we must put it into a container and take it to our local recycling. So we've just got to put the wheel back on now and torque them to the correct torque, 98 to 118 Newton meters, or somewhere in between those two figures. Now on to the second wheel. The second wheel in the correct sequence is the front left, and again here is an overview photograph to show all the key items we will come across. So not much different to the rear wheel. We can see the brake caliper, the bleed nipple, the brake line and hose, and the brake disc. So unfortunately this one was going to be just as much trouble as the last one, possibly even more so. Now I was hoping this would be easier because the bleed nipple is actually slightly larger, so it wasn't as rusty, but it didn't come out. So we're back to wire brushing. Having a quick look there. The disappointment again. Plus gas. And then heat. This one in some ways was actually more stubborn than the last one. So we get some heat on. I haven't sped this up because I thought it was quite important that people actually see how long I was heating it for. So if I sped it up, it might look like I'd been heating it for a long time. And it wasn't. I was just trying to give it short bursts. Just to try and loosen it with the least amount of heat, the least amount of shock. Because these are so fragile. So as I feel now, I can feel it's not going to turn. You just know it's not going to turn. And if you push it, it's going to shear. So you've got to really feel how this metal's going to go or react to putting too much torque on. So we do get some slight movement there. So as soon as you've got some movement, you're on your way. So it's then a case of be even more patient and just turn it backwards and forwards the slightest amount and just keep feeding the plus gas into it. And even if it's raining like it is in Wales, just sit there with an umbrella and keep going backwards and forwards. Backwards and forwards. I never thought I had this much patience. I think it was the fear of snapping that bleed nipple. A front caliper. Not going to be cheap, is it? So then we start getting some movement, but it's still binding again. So wind it back in. Until it actually comes out on its own without too much effort, you just have to keep winding it backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. And then it comes out. Fantastic. Back to bleeding then. Another one done. So clearly the other two are going to be the same as this, I presume. But anyway, so let's fill this bottle with the remaining half of this one container, because it will take, well, I'm going to use 2 containers, so I'm going to use 2 litres in total. So that's the end of my first litre. So we'll get that on the car now, and we'll connect this bleed tool. And I forgot to mention what this bleed tool was. This is the Sealey brake bleeding bottle, model number VSO212. Okay, so we'll get this filler bottle now hooked up onto the reservoir, open our valve and start bleeding. Time to start the bleeding process on the second wheel. So here we go. Speed this up so you can clearly see the fluid going in and the fluid coming out. And there it goes. I mean, a whole bottle should be more than enough to actually flush this through. It probably doesn't require anything like that. Probably 1 litre would probably be enough for a whole car. But since these bleed nipples look so bad, it certainly won't hurt to flush it all through. Considering it's what, £5 a litre for the brake fluid. So anyway, so we need to pinch the bleed nipple up tight again now. And we do that to 6.9 to 8.8 Newton meters. Don't over tighten or you might snap. Again, I'm just going to pop a bit of grease around there in preparation for removing these bleed nipples and putting new ones on. So we can just take this filler bottle off now, put the cap back on because we've got to move the car around to get to the third wheel. and then just tighten the wheel nuts again to the recommended torque of 98 to 118 Newton meters. It is a bit deja vu, all this, and our brake fluid is filling up there quite nicely. And the third wheel in the correct sequence is the rear left. And again, here is an overview photograph to show all the key items. So there's the handbrake cable, the brake disc, the brake caliper, the bleed nipple, and the rubber brake hose. So this is now the third wheel. And again, we've got a very similar picture of a corroded bleed nipple, which clearly is not going to come out. So we'll start with the old wire brushing again. Get all the rust off. Our trusty old plus gas. And of course heat. It does seem to be a combination of all of these. Now you have got to watch, there's the fuel filler on this side, so there is a fuel pipe going down to the tank, so you really don't want to get MAP gas anywhere near that. Admittedly it's not petrol, so it's not as flammable, but either way you still don't want to melt a pipe out inadvertently. So let's get some heat on this situation. We're starting to get the hang of this now. This process seems to work. I mean, there's always a first time for one of these to snap, and this is number 3. Obviously, if one of these does snap, it sort of gives me an issue with the video, because I won't be able to complete it in a reasonable time. So you can feel it that it's not going to move. You can just tell. You just know that if you keep going, it's going to shear. So we go for the old ratty-tatty hammer. Now I think I've got some movement there because we've got brake fluid coming down the handle. So yeah. But again, it's back and forwards. If you carry on just turning, it more than likely will bind and then shear. So you'd have done all that work for nothing. So it is... I try and speed this up, but I don't want to sort of omit any of the scenes, because then it gives an unrealistic impression as to how easy the job might have been. So if I try and leave these scenes in, you can actually see the process for real, as it were. So now we're getting some movement. That's it. So that might just come out now. But again, it's best just to be patient. And the slightest bit of resistance, you stop. And that one's out. So that's number 3. So the odds are in our favour at the moment. We've gone past 50%. So I'm just putting a bit of copperies on there. Like I said, I'm not sure whether you should use that. You probably shouldn't on braking systems, but for the moment I'm just going to use it. Like I say, I am going to remove these bleed nipples and put new ones in. So we've definitely got a drip there. We just better pinch it and snug it up tight while we go and fill that bottle. So we're on to the second bottle now. Nice new one again. So these are 1 litre bottles. They are about £5 each, I think. So it's not too expensive. And make sure you seal it. You don't want moisture getting into it from the air. So same old process. Bottle on the top. and clip it down. It does work quite nicely, this. I was going to pressure bleed the system, but the cap is different on the Nissan, which was a bit annoying, so I'm using this system instead. Now this bottle does have a one-way valve in it, so in theory air shouldn't get back in to the system. So we'll pop this on now, and then we should be ready to start the bleeding process on number 3. So then, time to start the bleeding process on that third wheel. So it's back into the car yet again and start pumping that brake pedal. Now, one thing that did concern me was looking at the actual video footage. I can see that the brake fluid in the reservoir is going down quicker than the bottle is dispensing the fluid. Now that's a little bit worrying, in that if the fluid went down too low, air would enter the system and then just fill back up with some brake fluid over the top of it. Now I'm hoping that that didn't go down right to the end, but you watch now, you can see the fluids playing catch up. So that is one thing of concern. I'm not sure whether I should be, although the brakes work fine, I don't know whether I should be giving that another check. But anyway, we remove the tube from the bleed nipple and pinch the nipple tight again. Now that bottle was very full, and remove the filler bottle, which I'm not very happy with. And I'm going to put a bit of grease back on there again, and then we just tighten these wheel nuts to the recommended torque, and we can then just put the third container of dirty brake fluid into our recycling container. Just how big or small is that brake fluid reservoir? So I thought I'd best find out, as I was starting to have a bit of a panic, and thankfully it looks like it's actually quite large. And lastly, the fourth and final wheel in the correct sequence is the front right, and here is an overview photograph showing the brake disc, bleed nipple, rubber brake hose, engine oil filter and the brake caliper. So finally, the fourth and last wheel. So let's hope this one goes as well as the others. I say well, they did come out. So there we are with our old plus gas again. I am amazed at how corroded these are, and it does make me wonder whether the brake fluid has ever been changed. If it's really this bad to try and get these bleed nipples out. Does seem to be quite a lot of surface rust on the underside of these 4x4s. I've noticed that with all the 4x4s. They all seem to, the Honda CR-V, the Suzuki Grand Vitara, and now the Nissan X-Trail, they all seem to have a lot of surface rust. So perhaps these items just seem to rust more on a 4x4 for some reason. But yeah, I've never come across them this bad. But hopefully this one will then come out. I think the tapping seems to help. That light tapping seems to just send some nice shock waves through there. So we'll try now. No. You can just tell it's just not, you know, when you think they're only tightened up to under 10 Newton meters, that's not a lot. So it shouldn't take a lot of torque to undo it. So now, oh, we've got a slight bit of movement there. See, a very tiny bit of movement. So once you've got that tiny bit of movement, all you got to do is just keep playing with it. Just work it back and forwards, bit by bit, until it goes further and further around. Keep it well lubricated with a penetrating fluid, and just keep going back and forth, and then hopefully it will just keep going undone like that. So the fourth one is a success story as well. That is good news. So just tighten that, get the plus gas in there as well. Okay, so I'm just going to unwind that. You can see the brake fluid there is actually dripping out. So you do want to contain under that. Don't really want it to leave it to go on the floor. So I've just put a bit more copper ease on that, like I did on the others. And I'll tighten that up, just pinch it temporarily before we start the bleeding process. So that's good news. All four of them have come undone, and it may have taken some time, but it saves time messing about later on if you make a mistake. So this is our final quarter of the 2 litres in total, and we'll sit that on the top. And try a slightly different camera angle here. I can show the actual brake caliper and the fluid reservoir bottle on the top there at the same time. Time to start the bleeding process on this, the final fourth wheel. So undo that. There we go. And we can start pumping away. People may wonder why moisture would get into this system even though it's sealed. And the thing is, moisture, everything is porous, including the rubber hoses. You've got the cap on the reservoir, and you've got some rubber seals in the piston, and moisture can get past all these items and into the system. So you do need to do this, which is advisable every 2 years. Okay, so that one's done as well. It's all had a very good flush now. So we can take that bottle off. Needs to be topped up just a slight amount there to the maximum, bit under. You must put the filter back on. You certainly don't want anything falling down into that and messing around with the piston in the master cylinder. That would be pretty terrible. So I've got a little bit more in the bottle, which ironically brings it exactly up to the maximum, which is good news. So that's both bottles completely used and emptied, because really you can't store this. Being hygroscopic, it's not really something you want to be storing. So we can just make sure that's tight, do that up to the recommended Newton meters, and remove that one. So always wash your hands after touching brake fluid, and obviously if you get it on the car, you definitely want to rinse it off pretty quick. It's not good for the car. And then we got to just do those wheel nuts. Always use a torque wrench. It's the safest way of knowing that they're actually done up properly and not over tightened. Quite often people over tighten the nuts, which is equally as bad, especially if you have a breakdown at the side of the road and you can't take the wheel nuts off because somebody's over tightened them. Okay, so this is job done then. We'll take it for a test drive. First of all, we'll just put the remaining brake fluid in. So that looks pretty dirty. And we take that down to council recycling. 4 new bleed nipples later. So 4 new bleed nipples arrived in the post for under a £5. Not too bad. So I think we'll get these changed. Now I was using copper grease before and these came with silicone, so I presume that is the correct material. So we'll go with silicone. So I'm going to do it in the same order as before. Don't forget to torque them. I'm torquing them to 8 Newton meters. So I have clamped the hose there so that no fluid was going to leak out. And then we're onto the front left. Do the same, clamp it up. I get the old silicone grease on the new nipple. I have loosened the nipple there so I can just unwind it by hand and pop the new one in lightning fast, just as an added precaution. You might actually struggle to measure 8 Newton meters. It's not a lot at all. It's basically very gentle by hand. As we know, if you over tighten, they tend to snap. And thankfully we got away with that on the old ones. So we definitely don't want to snap a new one. So rear left, that's in. It's just more reassuring to know that these have actually got brand new bleed nipples in now, just in case those old ones failed or something like that. Better to be safe than sorry. And this is the last one, which is the front right. And obviously if copperies was the wrong stuff, it's better that these old ones come out and the new ones go in with the proper silicone grease. Okay, so that's job done. So that should be all finished now. And here's some photographs for reference. So starting here, we can see the rear right brake, and there we can see the brake caliper with the bleed nipple, clearly the brake disc, the brake line and hose, and the handbrake cable. And then the infamous bleed nipple. And then onto the front left, again we can see the brake caliper, brake disc, the brake line and hose, and the bleed nipple. And then the rear left, we can see the handbrake cable, brake disc, brake caliper, bleed nipple, and the rubber hose. And lastly the front right brake, and there's the brake disc, the bleed nipple, the rubber hose. You can actually see the engine oil filter there in green, and the brake caliper. And here's an under bonnet view showing the brake fluid bottle, the power steering fluid, the screen wash container, and the engine oil filler cap. And a close up of the brake fluid reservoir showing the internal filter and the cap. And here's a side view of that reservoir to show how much fluid it holds. And then using a torch to highlight the fluid in the reservoir. And here's the ABS actuator and the electrical connector to it, and the brake lines coming off. And here's a couple of photos showing my new brake nipples when they arrived. Thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe.